In today's social media driven world, there's so much information coming at you that it's hard to know sometimes what's true and perhaps more importantly, what is relevant to you. And that's certainly the case with nutrition, not least performance nutrition. My aim with this episode is to remove the frustration of wondering what out of all the information out there is useful and relevant to you and your goals. And in order to do that, I want to give you 10 key principles that you can focus on in order to optimize your body composition, health, and performance as an athlete. The first one is meet energy demands. As obvious as it sounds, you can't expect the body to continue outputting high levels of training and competing if you don't give it the fuel to do so. In fact, if you continue to do this, not only will your performance and recovery suffer, but you'll also put yourself at risk of what's known as relative energy deficiency in sport, or REDS. This can occur when the body starts to downregulate essential bodily processes as a result of you continuing to output high levels of activity without providing adequate fuel. So in other words, the body recognizes you're stubborn enough to keep training in spite of not having sufficient fuel to do so. So it takes that energy from elsewhere. That could be from systems that affect your immune function, your bone health, cardiovascular system, your reproductive health. For example, females living the monthly period. Could be the growth of development in the case of young athletes. But on the flip side of that, there is a such thing as overfueling. That is, if you give your body more energy than it needs for training in everyday life, the extra energy will be stored predominantly as body fat. Now, of course, if you're wanting to gain muscle, then weight gain can be beneficial, but that can easily be taken too far to the point of gaining more body fat than muscle. Alternatively, you might actually want to be in an energy deficit if fat loss is your goal, and in that case, keys to avoiding REDS include avoiding severe energy deficits, constraining the duration of the fat loss phase, periodizing your fueling around training and competition, and ensuring that the rest of your nutrition is as on point as possible. Second aspect is that carbohydrates will fuel hard training and competition. Once you have your overall energy balance in a good place, you can start to look at where those calories come from, and that is the macronutrient breakdown of those calories. The first of those we'll consider here is carbohydrates. And carbohydrates come from sources like rice, pasta, breads, oats, fruits, cereals, as well as sugar-containing foods. And when we consume these carbohydrate-containing foods, they're broken down into glucose, and that glucose circulates around the blood, where if it is not used right away, then it is stored as glycogen, mainly in the muscles and the liver. This glycogen will then remain stored until it is required for either everyday tasks or, more importantly in this case, in the case of high intensity activity, where it is the predominant and preferred fuel source. Now, we can use this knowledge to our advantage by consuming sufficient carbohydrates on an ongoing basis, and potentially also biasing that intake of them around training periods, as we'll discuss later. And a general recommendation is to consume 3 to 6 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day for athletes. Even with that large range of 3 to 6 grams, many athletes' intake requirements will fall outside of that based on individual physical characteristics, as well as preferences and overall training loads and intensities. The third aspect, then, the third key, is protein provides the building blocks. So the second macronutrient we're talking about here is protein. And the first thing to consider is that your muscles and other bodily tissues are protein-based structures, and that is, they are made of protein. Now, the protein within your body making up these structures is in a constant state of flux, being broken down and built up simultaneously throughout your daily life. And you increase the breakdown of those tissues during training, but by training you also put a stimulus on those tissues to adapt and grow. And by providing sufficient protein on an ongoing basis, you'll decrease the protein breakdown side of that equation, and you'll also support the protein synthesis side, i.e. the protein building side of things, leading to overall improved recovery and muscle adaptation as well as growth. And the general recommendation for athletes is to consume about 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, preferably spread across 3 to 5 meals. This can be consumed through sources like meat, chicken, fish, eggs, tofu, milk, and other dairy products. And the third macronutrient, which makes up our fourth key point, are healthy fats. The topic of fat intake has been controversial for decades. It's gone from being this demonized nutrient that is supposedly the major cause of all ill health to actually being celebrated and promoted by those who promote, say, a ketogenic or carnivore diet, for example. And by looking at the scientific evidence, it's becoming clear that the answer is likely somewhere in the middle, and that the source of those fats is probably a bigger determinant of their effect on health. Take the Mediterranean diet, for example, which is commonly rightly cited as one of the healthiest diets. It's relatively high in fat, but relatively low in saturated fats. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't have any saturated fats in your diet, but it still should give you some clues, especially when you compare the Mediterranean diet to diets high in saturated fat in the scientific literature and observe the negative effects of that. Regardless, we still know that having some fat in our diet is essential. And one example of this is that omega-3 fatty acids can't be created within the body, unlike many other nutrients which can be created from combining other nutrients. These therefore need to be consumed through food or supplementation in order to meet the baseline levels and to avoid the downsides of deficiencies. And even outside of that, fatty acids are required for the creation of structures of the cells in our body, the creation of our own body's hormones, and in the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. And let's be honest, your diet would become pretty bland and boring without any fat. My general recommendation with fat is to consume somewhere in the range of 0.75 to 5 grams per kilogram of body weight, aiming to get most of that from unsaturated sources like oils, like olive oil, nuts, seeds, avocado, and fatty fish, whilst also allowing some room for saturated fats that are within other foods that you're eating, like meat and dairy, for example. The fifth aspect, the fifth key to performance nutrition is fiber, fruit, and veg are critical to health. And it's no secret that fruits and vegetables and other fiber-rich foods are so-called good for you, but it can be difficult to know what that actually means. And I've noticed that lack of clarity can lead to athletes and people in general not taking their intake of these foods seriously and therefore not getting the benefits. There are many aspects of these foods worth exploring, and I will do so in other episodes, but the main important aspects as I see them are A, fiber firstly is crucial for digestive health, helping to regulate bowel movements, allowing for efficient excretion of the waste products of digestion. That is not all it does. Fiber also provides the food for your gut microbiota. That's the tiny living microorganisms in your gut. And the byproducts that are created by these microorganisms consuming the fiber are known as short-chain fatty acids. And without going into too much detail, which again I'll do in future episodes, these short-chain fatty acids are involved in a wide range of health and performance-related outcomes, including immune function, cardiovascular health, inflammation regulation, and even mental well-being. And for athletes, this means better nutrient absorption, reduced illness, reduced disease risk, and improved recovery, among other things. Along with that, the micronutrients, the vitamins, the minerals, and the phytonutrients are involved in virtually every aspect and process within the body. They support energy production, bone health, immune function, muscle contraction, and the reduction of the oxidative stress that comes along with training. For example, iron is essential for the oxygen transport within the blood. Calcium and vitamin D support bone density, and antioxidants help combat the inflammation caused by intense exercise. Without adequate intake of these nutrients from the diet, you're likely to experience fatigue, increased injury risk, slow recovery, compromised performance, and even if you're hitting your macronutrient targets. In terms of actual recommendations, the good news is that by consuming a variety of colourful fruits and vegetables, along with things like whole grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes each day, you're likely going to cover your bases for both fibre and micronutrients. And I'd recommend a target of around 5 portions of fruit and veg and 5 portions of other fibre-rich foods daily as a minimum. However, having a specific fibre intake target, for example, 10 plus grams per 1,000 calories, might be a useful addition if someone is already tracking their food intake. And there are cases where it might be appropriate also to assess the intake of specific micronutrients or even test blood markers to assess for potential deficiencies. Rule number 7 of performance nutrition then is that fluids keep things flowing. Your body is made up of over 50% water, And we lose water on a daily basis throughout training, sweating, urination and breathing. And if that leads to as little as 2% of body weight loss, for example 1.5 kg for a 75 kg athlete, athletic performance becomes negatively affected. Considering an hour of exercise could lead to a 1.5 litre or 1.5 kg loss of sweat, it shouldn't be surprising how important it is to stay on top of fluid intake in order to avoid dehydration. This is important because of how your hydration levels affect how your body works. And in simplistic terms, I like to think of water as keeping things flowing within the body. That could refer to the effect it has on blood viscosity, or how thick the blood is, where hydration can lead to the blood becoming thicker, making it harder for the blood to pump around the body, and therefore how efficient it is for the nutrients and the oxygen to get to the working muscles and brain, and how effectively waste products can then be removed, both of which will have a massive impact on your physical and mental performance. Less fluid also leads to less sweating, which can have a negative effect on performance given the cooling effect of sweating. The flowing analogy also applies to your joints, which rely on synovial fluid for lubrication and cushioning between bones, and the body's ability to create this fluid depends on having sufficient fluid flowing within the body. It also extends to digestion, where dehydration can cause constipation, leading to discomfort, bloating, and impaired nutrient absorption. Dehydration also affects and is affected by electrolyte status within the body, which plays a crucial role in fluid balance, nerve function, and muscle contraction. In terms of recommendations, there will obviously be a lot of individual variation, but most athletes will benefit from consuming 2.5 to 3.5 litres per day. That said, the preferred recommendation for daily fluid intake is to drink to thirst, or better yet, drink to avoid thirst. This makes use of the body's inbuilt mechanism to avoid dehydration, and in doing so takes into account your individual requirements, varying environmental conditions like heat, and fluctuations in training loads. In addition to that daily recommendation to drink to thirst, I recommend that athletes be more specific than that with their hydration around the training and competition window, aiming to consume an equal or greater amount of fluid in the peri-performance, that is before, during and after performance or training, to what is lost during that performance period. That means that if you are losing 1.5 litres of fluid measured by body weight loss during a training session or competition, you should aim to consume that amount throughout the peri-performance period. For example, that could mean 500 mils in the 30 minutes before training, 500 mils during it, and 500 mils afterwards. And if the exact numbers feel overwhelming, or you just don't want to go through the process of finding out your numbers, you can simply focus on ensuring adequate daily hydration by drinking to thirst, and adding to it by getting in some extra fluids before, during, and after training sessions and competition. Rule number 8 then is that carb loading superfuels the tank. I've already spoken about the role of carbs and how consuming carbs lead to increased glycogen stores in the body, and how that glycogen is the preferred source used in high intensity activity. In addition to a moderate to high ongoing carbohydrate intake, you can make further use of this knowledge by increasing your carbohydrate intake in the day or days prior to competition. This short-term increase in carbohydrate intake will result in the body increasing its ability to store glycogen, and the extra carbohydrates provided then will be stored and available on competition day. This is especially important for events like a marathon, where glycogen depletion can become the defining factor affecting whether someone succeeds in hitting their goal time or even finishing the race. But even in sports where competition isn't long enough for glycogen to become near depletion levels, like a football match, it can still be beneficial to go into the match with high levels of glycogen, ensuring that ample supply is there of that fuel for the match. And this could be as simple as adding in an extra portion of carbohydrates to each meal in the day before the match, or in the few days before the race. But if you want more accuracy, then aiming to consume somewhere in the range of 6 to 10 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight per day in the day or days leading up to the event is a good general target. That target should be towards the higher end in terms of grams and days if the duration and the intensity of the event is higher, and towards the lower end for shorter and less intense events. For an example, a GAA player might aim to hit about 7 grams per kilogram of body weight the day before a match, i.e. about 525 grams for a 75 kg athlete, but a marathon runner might aim to hit 10 grams per kilogram of body weight for 2 full days before the event. Rule number 8 then is that pre and intra-training nutrition gives an extra boost. So you can extend the benefit of carbohydrate intake even further by providing more in the period immediately before and during the training session or competition. And in this case, the idea isn't so much to increase the glycogen storage, since this process can take a few hours, but more so to provide an immediate source of glucose to be used there and then, such that the use of the stored glycogen is reduced, thereby delaying the point at which fatigue sets in due to depleted glycogen. And again, this becomes more important in longer, more sustained sports like distance running, which is why you'll see the focus being high on consuming energy gels and the likes during races. But it can also be useful in shorter duration sports where carbohydrate consumption seems to work through mechanisms other than simply fueling. And that's exemplified by studies showing that even just swirling a carb drink around your mouth without even swallowing it can bring benefit, and therefore without providing extra fuel we can still see a performance benefit. For these reasons, it can be worth experimenting with consuming up to 60 grams per hour of activity during the period before and during the event, as opposed to ongoing carbohydrate intake, which I generally recommend coming from mostly complex carbohydrate sources, usually whole foods. You'll benefit from focusing on carbohydrate intake around more simple carbohydrates or high GI carbohydrates during the intra-performance period. This can include things like sports drinks and energy gels, but could also include food-based sources like fruit juices, sugary sweets, and highly refined starchy foods like bagels, rice cakes, and cereals. Rule number 9 then is that post-training nutrition kickstarts recovery. Now, recovery isn't confined to the period immediately after training or competition. And you'll know this if you've ever woken up sore the day after a tough training session. That means that your recovery period is usually the total time between the end of one session and the start of the next. So if your nutrition doesn't reflect that through consistent intake of sufficient calories, protein and micronutrients, no amount of focus on the post-training period alone will solve your recovery issues. With that said, it logically and logistically makes sense to optimize your post-training nutrition as much as possible, given that's when the body will most be in need of supportive nutrition. And the main principles of recovery nutrition here can be summarized as 3 R's: repair, replenish, and rehydrate. The repair component focuses on protein intake to support muscle recovery and growth and adaptation. During training, muscle fibers experience damage and breakdown, and consuming protein in the post-training window provides the amino acids necessary to stimulate that muscle protein synthesis that we're looking, facilitating the repair and rebuilding of that muscle tissue. Whereas without adequate protein, the body may break down protein from other areas to support recovery, which can compromise overall muscle maintenance and adaptation. Replenishing then refers to primarily restoring glycogen stores through carbohydrate intake. We know that high intensity training depletes the carbohydrates stored in the muscles and liver, and consuming carbohydrates after training initiates that refueling process, which is particularly important if your next session is within 24 hours. There's also evidence that the post-training period offers a window of enhanced insulin sensitivity, meaning carbohydrates consumed during that time will be stored as glycogen more efficiently. The third R, rehydration, refers to replacing the fluids lost through sweat during your session. And proper rehydration is crucial not only to replacing what was lost, but also to supporting the recovery process itself. When you're not adequately hydrated, your blood isn't flowing as efficiently as it could, and therefore delivering nutrients to the working muscles and removing the waste products from the muscles doesn't happen as effectively. And therefore, by increasing blood viscosity as a result of dehydration, we can slow down the recovery process and impair the adaptation we're getting from the training. In practical terms, a meal or a snack containing both protein and carbohydrates within 1 to 2 hours after training, alongside adequate fluids, will allow you to tick those 3 boxes. And this could be a chicken and rice bowl with vegetables, a smoothie made with protein powder, banana and berries, a Greek yogurt with granola and fruit, or even something like a chicken sandwich and a glass of milk. The 10th and final rule of performance nutrition for me is food first, but not food only. So focusing on supplementation without addressing areas we've already talked about is likely to be a waste of time and money. But if you have your overall nutrition in a good place, then supplements can certainly be of benefit. I tend to think of supplements as falling into 2 categories: food supplements and performance supplements. And whilst there is certainly some crossover, for the most part, food supplements provide nutrients that can be found in food and are necessary for the body to function, but which you struggle to get through food alone, or just find more convenient to get through supplements. This includes things like protein powders, carbohydrates powders or gels, electrolytes, fish oils, and vitamins and minerals like vitamin D, magnesium. Whereas on the other hand, performance supplements are generally not necessary for normal bodily function. For example, not taking them wouldn't risk deficiency, but rather that they can provide a performance boost above what food alone can provide. That includes things like caffeine, creatine, beta-alanine, sodium bicarbonate, and other more advanced supplements. And out of any section here, supplementation tends to be the one that requires the most individual approach. So I can't provide a complete list here, but what I will say is that for most athletes, protein powder can be useful in allowing you to hit your daily protein targets. Carbohydrate supplements can be useful in and around the training and competition period. Fish oils and vitamin D can be useful for most of us who don't get enough sunlight or eat enough oily fish. And creatine can be beneficial to most sporting goals that require high intensity outputs. So after listening to all that, you'll be somewhere on the scale from completely overwhelmed to feeling happy that you're nailing your nutrition. If you're towards the lower end of that, great, because you've been surviving without having any nutrition in check. So the only way is up. And in this case, I'd recommend you start with the first few points and work your way through them in order over the coming weeks and months. And if you're at the higher end of that scale, that's also great. You can hopefully feel confident that you're doing most of what needs done from a nutritional perspective, and you can continue to do so whilst also continuing to look for further areas of improvement. Thanks for listening. If you'd like more free resources or info about my performance nutrition coaching program, hit the link in the podcast description.